With the recent political assassination of Charlie Kirk, the Denver school shooting the exact same day, intense protests in both France and Nepal, Russian drones in Poland, and Israel bombing Qatar, it's been a hectic week. Throughout all of this, the rhetoric has really ratcheted up here in the States. After Charlie Kirk's assassination, posts on X with hundreds of thousands of likes were posted about Kirk, quote, getting what he deserved. Large personalities on the MAGA side of all of this, with thousands and thousands of likes, posted about how they did this. They have started a war. We are now at war. With they, of course, being the left. Trump, in his announcement on the assassination of Kirk, also blamed the radical left for the political violence in the US. So while I'm not going to look into the question of whether or not Kirk deserved to be assassinated, because the answer to any thinking person is obviously no, the question of who is to blame for the political violence we're experiencing in the US is important if we want to return to a democratic society where ideas can be debated without fear of death. Hey, I'm your host Dylan, and I'm not going to be making any political claims about whether or not Charlie Kirk was a good man or if his ideas were good. I just want to figure out what's caused the recent increase in American political violence, and if the political left is to blame for this, as those on the right have been claiming. I'll look at the data, the research, and the statistics to stay as unbiased as possible in this crazy biased environment of politics and figure out the question for today's video. First, we'll start by looking at whether or not this assassination was a leftist political assassination. The history and repeating of political violence in the US, is the left to blame more than the right, and the contagiousness of political assassinations, and how rhetoric plays into all of this. The answers to these questions were much deeper than I expected and had different answers than what I had going into this. So obviously the assassination of Charlie Kirk was political. Kirk was possibly the most influential MAGA Republican outside of Trump himself in both spreading the beliefs and message and getting people elected. And after the shooter was taken into custody and the bullets were examined, they found a few phrases on them. Phrases like, "Hey fascist, catch," or lyrics to the anti-fascist Italian song, Bella Ciao. In addition to this, there was also weird online talk like noses bulges. Oh whoa, what's this? If you read this, you are gay, Lamau. So what it looks like from the limited information that we have at the moment is that the shooter, Tyler Robinson, was not very political for most of his life, and then got radicalized by the internet. It probably started going to full force during the 2024 election, possibly incited by what many Democrats were claiming Trump's presidency was going to be. Most notably to establish an authoritarian fascist state.
Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Enhanced by the multiple assassination attempts on Trump, which were extremely close to being successful, showing that political assassinations, even on former presidents, were possible to pull off. And somewhere along the line where Robinson saw that Kirk was going to be close to a college in his area, knew how much he disagreed with everything Kirk stood for, and decided to attempt and ultimately succeed to assassinate Kirk. A few left-wing analysts on the mainstream media outlets like to deflect by saying stuff like, "We don't know his true motives. And anyway, why can't we just say all political violence is bad?"
Seeing the fascism and the like, yeah.
Do you? No, I don't think we know. Just to be clear, I mean, just law enforcement people. I don't think we know the meaning of his message. We know his history.
Bella Ciao is an anti-fascist thing. It says fascists catch this.
Then I'll give you his history. Then I'll give you his history. Right? Think about his history. His history, but this is not the
Why are we debating it?
This is what I'm talking about. That's why I wanted to tell you. This was my point, not yours. This was my point, not yours. The point is, who cares? A man was killed. And you have yet to say political violence is bad, period.
This just seems silly given that the bullet carvings literally reference fascism and describe Kirk as a fascist. And anytime fascism is brought up in a modern political context, It's from Democrats accusing Republicans or Trump of doing something fascist. So the assassination was definitely political and likely influenced by left-wing rhetoric. But political violence is not new in the US, which many people tend to forget. We have had some awful periods in our political history. But they also give us a pattern that we can look at to figure out what's going on in our modern time. So first, let us look at the major assassinations from 1960 to the 1980s. And then from there, we'll look into the patterns that we've been seeing in the last 5 years. Starting in the 1960s, there were a few major assassinations that most of us probably already know about. With John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, and many more. This was all done during the Civil Rights Movement, where those that wanted to keep racial segregation in the South alive and well went about it in assassinating who they saw as the reasons that blacks were getting equal rights in the South. In the 1970s, things turned down a little bit, but still got pretty bad when Governor George Wallace was shot by a would-be assassin but ended up surviving, and where Gerald Ford faced 2 assassinations in just 1 month. And then in 1981, at the start of his first term, Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated after a bullet ricocheted off a nearby car and hit Reagan. These were all politically driven assassinations, where people saw what the democratic process produced and decided that they didn't like what the majority of Americans wanted, and instead were going to change that themselves. And then, once assassinations work, and once they see that it hurts the progress of the movements involved, it begins to spread as more and more people see the usefulness and validity of political assassinations. Now let us move over to our recent history in the past 5 years or so. In 2020, there was a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, which was only foiled because of the FBI. In 2021, a mob stormed the Capitol of the United States in an effort to force a recount and to overturn the election results. Around the same time, pipe bombs were found at both the Democratic and Republican National Committee headquarters. In 2022, a man broke into the house of Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House at the time, and intended to kidnap her. She was absent, but the intruder decided to assault her 82-year-old husband, Paul Pelosi, with a hammer, fracturing his skull. In 2024, at Butler County, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump was very nearly assassinated at a rally. A little while later, there was another attempted assassination on the president's life again. In 2025, this year, Molotov cocktails were thrown into the home of Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania during Passover. Again this year, Melissa Hortman, the former House Speaker of Minnesota, and her husband were both murdered in a political assassination. During the same time, State Senator John Hoffman and his wife were both nearly killed by assassins as well.
I think what happened in the Pelosi's house, it is an example of what can happen when people are driven to these incredible extremes, to try to act on political goals and ideals and political desires, and it crosses over this line into physical violence against politicians.
And then, of course, September 10th, Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, was shot by Tyler Robinson and died soon after, while giving a speech at Utah Valley State University. Other than making you a bit sad, you can probably see that there's been a mix of both left-wing and right-wing political violence. And while we may think that some of the reactions to the recent assassination of Kirk are crazy, they're also not new. For example, when talking about the break-in incident to the Pelosi home, Elon Musk shared a post from a right-wing news organization that suggested that the attack resulted from a drunken Paul Pelosi having a fight with a male prostitute. And then this sentiment was then shared by many influential people on the right, including Donald Trump's own son. With knowing this history, first, it's pretty clear that the majority of Americans are not fond of political violence, at least in the moment. But with knowing American history, how do the two sides of politics differ in their opinions on political assassinations? Is the left or the right more to blame for America's political violence? So first, let's go through some basics. 81.7% of people believe that the US is headed in the wrong direction. 81.7%. 67.2% believes that there's a serious threat to democracy, and 23% thought there may be a threat. 36% think that America is run for the wealthy. Another 36% think there's a chance that America is run for the wealthy. And 66.2% believe that the 2020 election was not stolen. Before you start thinking all political and start thinking about modern day, all this data was collected from 2023. Now let's dive into the actual opinions on political violence. The first thing to look at is that most general studies for political violence all across the world say that far-right organizations are much more likely to be part of political violence. Specifically, in these studies defined as violent radical behavior. Left-wing radical behavior was still very common, just more likely to be non-violent radical behavior. Of course, this all depends on what you define as far right, what you define as far left, what even gets counted as political violence. There's a lot of nuance behind just these blanketed statements. And then specifically in the American context, a study came out that correlated blue sky usage and the memification of Luigi Mangione with support for assassinating Elon Musk and Donald Trump. The same study found that 48% and 55% of left-of-center respondents believed it was at least somewhat justifying to murder Elon Musk and Donald Trump respectively. And nearly 40% of respondents stated that it was at least somewhat acceptable to destroy a Tesla dealership in protest. All these beliefs are very highly correlated with one another, along with justification for the murder of United Healthcare CEO and hyper-partisan left-wing ideology, whatever this study defines that as. Of course, it's important to know the hypotheticals, as all these questions were framed, can be much different than if these people were in a position to actually pull the trigger, but it is still a concerning belief to even have hypothetically. But this is only shared from 2 different studies, which is not a whole lot to go off, but it's still very concerning. However, conservatives, Republicans still have something to worry about too, because Republicans have consistently been more likely to agree with the statement. Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. They have agreed with this statement more than independents and Democrats for the past 5 years, reaching close to 40% of all Republicans agreeing after January 6th. In addition, 1 in 4 Republicans, around 24%, agree that the 2024 election is compromised by voter fraud. Quote, "Everyday Americans will need to ensure the rightful leader takes office, even if it requires taking violent actions." Perhaps those statements could be okay if democracy was actually under threat, and there was a lot of evidence to base it off of. But from the past actions of January 6th and afterwards, where it was said that democracy was failing and being compromised, but most people in power knew Donald Trump had lost, it scares you for what little truth there actually would need to be behind voter fraud claims for violence to start. So obviously, political violence is boiling in the US from both leftists and rightists. And the most common reason given for this increase in political violence is rhetoric. That's what everyone's talking about now. Rhetoric, rhetoric, rhetoric. And research has found that indeed rhetoric has gotten more polarized. And specifically, rhetoric has gotten the most polarized around issues that are most likely to convince the general public. For example, right-leaning users are twice as likely to use polarized rhetoric about immigration, and left-leaning users are more than twice as likely to use polarized language around healthcare. They understand that these issues persuade the public most for them. And so they use polarized language and make this seem like life or death. It makes voters more likely to walk into a voting booth and vote for those reasons. The same study also concluded that politicians on the right have had the sharpest increase in polarized rhetoric. However, this study was from 2023, so things could have changed. This is important to note because rhetoric tends to get more polarized when one side is out of power. And that side out of power has more to talk about because the side in power has more failures for the opposing side to talk about. A real-world example of this increased rhetoric is from the 2024 election. For example, Democratic politicians calling Trump and company fascists, threat to democracy, white supremacists, traitor, con man, insurrectionists. Whether or not you believe these words are true, it is no doubt that they turn the temperature up. And especially after Trump won, may drive people to think that the only way that they can stop a fascist, authoritarian, white supremacist, traitor from ruining the country is to go to political violence. Maybe there just isn't enough time for new voting. However, this is of course not one-sided. There are plenty of examples of Republicans being just as bad. There's examples of Trump and other Republicans saying that Harris is mentally impaired, happened to turn black, a DEI pick, gun-grabbing communist, or linking Harris with letting monsters, stone-cold killers, and vile animals into the country when referring to illegal aliens. Or, and this is the first time I've ever heard about this, when J.D. Vance said, quote, "The big difference between conservatives and liberals is that no one has tried to kill Kamala Harris in the last couple of months, and 2 people now have tried to kill Donald Trump in the last couple of months." Maybe that's getting at a true point, but it probably could have been said in a way that didn't need to say, "No one has tried to kill Kamala Harris." Definitely an example of bad, possibly dangerous rhetoric. And to not be very journalistic by just looking through X and the section about Kirk, comments from the right saying this is war, or they did this. And comments from the left saying he deserved it, or this is what he asked for when referring to his video a few years back saying that you gotta protect the Second Amendment even if it means, unfortunately, some gun deaths every year. This really goes to show you just how bad disagreements have gotten between opposing political Americans. Violence is not universally condemned, and everyone on the other side is the worst possible thing you can imagine. What happened to Charlie Kirk was terrible. He was very controversial, being very confronted with his conversations, and doing everything he could to further goals that a large amount of Americans wanted the complete opposite of. But to believe that his death was deserved or that it was a good thing is truly evil. And it's not a one-off thing. Political violence is increasing in America. And when it comes to the claim of whether or not the left is to blame for political violence, yes, but also no. Currently, left-wing social media and online culture needs to have a close eye. Because for the ability of half of left-of-center Americans to at least somewhat justify killing and murdering and assassinating the elected president of the United States is beyond concerning. And specifically regarding the assassination of Kirk, the online left did a great deal in radicalizing the would-be shooter, in addition to the tumultuous rhetoric and presidency of Donald Trump. And while the online left may have an outsized role in this particular assassination, as you have seen, it is not like the online right, far right, whatever you want to call them, have not been brewing up violent environments that make more assassinations out of people like Melissa Hortman and her husband more and more likely. If future generations of America want to keep a thriving democracy, political assassinations of all kinds need to be condemned universally, and rhetoric needs to be turned down on all sides. I know by just saying those words, most people aren't listening anymore. But the truth is that elections in the US are conducted with such emotionally charged and violent words that leads to further radicalization of the most extreme sorts of Americans. And that truly does not need to happen. Even if you don't agree with a single word ever spoken by Charlie Kirk, let his death be a lesson of the fragility of our political system. And let us take steps from our current assassination culture from becoming even worse.